This is going to be one of the very practical discussions which we have ever had till now in this whole series. Mm, Shankranti just came and went by, right? Happy Shankranti to all who celebrate. Happy Pongal. It has different names in different places. I remember in 2010 or 2011, one of the Shankranti days, early morning, one of my patients knocked the door and came to my home. This person used to visit to a temple which is outside my house, and he knew this is the home. And he said, "Sir, I thought I'll give you a small gift," and he gave the gift to me. The gift was a small box of sweets, and I said, "Okay, thank you," and I just took it. Uh, I saw a cover along with the gift, and I opened the cover and I saw some 5,000 bucks in it. Um, uh, when he gave me this 5,000 bucks, is when I realized something is happening. And I asked the husband and the son who had come along, why are they giving this money to me? Because they have paid all the consultation fees and there's no pending fee and those things. That's when they said, no, sir, this cover was asked to be handed over to you because my wife said whatever happens at any point of time, if there's any anxiety or panic attack, they want to access me 24 bar 7 like an hotline. And they said this 5,000 rupees is to keep that hotline active. Now, welcome to anxiety, discussions on anxiety issues, panic, and other scenarios, which is quite a challenge in a lot of people whom we see. And these kind of scenarios, I'm sure you would have dealt with where people have demands which they put up, not because they want to treat you like a what to say, a machine where they can buy you, but because they're so anxious. And when they know that this person is able to help them, they are extremely not wanting to leave you, and they want become quite dependent on the therapist or the doctor or even the medication sometimes. So we'll talk about some of those important aspects. So when you're talking about anxiety or in general, you need to understand people can present with different kinds of symptoms, but there are two important symptoms which we should look for. One is fear, other one is worry. These are two crucial important symptoms which we should look for when you're talking about anxiety in specific. Now, what you also need to understand here is when you're talking about this fear and worry, you need to understand those are not the only symptoms. There are a lot of other important symptoms which can come in. Patients with anxiety can present with various symptoms like your sleep disturbance, arousal issues, panic attacks, fatigue, concentration, compulsive behavior, avoidance behavior, muscle tension, confusion, irritability. There are a bunch of symptoms which people will not come and say I have anxiety disorder. People will come with vague symptoms sometimes to need to be as a good clinician. I am sure a lot of times as a clinician, you might be stumped when a patient comes and says, okay, doc, do you think I have anxiety or do you think I have depression? Now, this is a question I'm sure they will ask you. So, Sriram, can you put up a poll with just two choices? Two choices poll, please. Um, Yes. Choice one is you have seen people who come and ask you with this question, anxiety or depression, and you feel it is easy to say whether it is anxiety or depression. So if you choose choice one, you are saying it's easy to differentiate anxiety and depression. Choice two is it is extremely difficult to say whether it is anxiety or depression. So let me see what do the people who are attending this answer. Choice one or choice two? Choice one is where you say it's easy to answer. Choice two is where people find it very difficult to say. I'm not sure whether the poll was put up, Shriram. It came in a different way. Ross,
It is
did
going
you get
on.
the answer?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Seven,
So, anyways, I'm not able to see. Can you just tell me approximately how many of them
seven,
have chosen choice one?
70, 76% of them have chosen choice two, sir.
Okay, 76% of the people have chosen that it is very difficult for them to differentiate anxiety and depression. But as a clinician, right, one of the answers we will always commonly come up with and tell our clients or the patients is see, don't worry too much about whether it's anxiety or depression. Most of the medicines which work in anxiety work in depression. So it's the same almost the treatment. So you don't need to worry, we'll take care of it. Now, This is a good enough answer for them because most of the times they are okay with the answer you give. But I'm sure in our heads, we are always wondering, is this person having anxiety or depression? Should I be giving more of an anxiolytic or more of an antidepressant? So we'll try to take up challenges like this and address further in our discussion. So what you need to understand is what approach you want to take. You want to take an approach of treating the symptoms of the client, or you want to take an approach of making a diagnosis and then treating the diagnosis. Now, each one has its own benefits and its own challenges. So it necessarily doesn't mean one is better or the other one is better. But it's important for us to understand as a clinician, what are we more tuned to? Because our patients are going to ask us, why are you putting this medication on? And why are you not putting some other medication which they would have read on the internet? So at that time, we need to say, why are we kind of prescribing a particular medication? Are we looking at a symptom or are we looking at a diagnosis? Definitely, it's a good idea always to three medication for three different symptoms. But you need to understand when you're dealing with anxiety, it's a different issue. One thing we know when you're dealing with anxiety as a issue, anxiety disorder is extremely comorbid. What do you mean by this? Anxiety disorder is extremely comorbid, means a lot of people with anxiety disorder not necessarily have only anxiety disorder. They have a lot of other issues, substance use disorders, they can have depression, they can have sometimes psychosis, they can have bipolar disorder, they can have a lot of marital conflict, psychological issues which are leading to it. They can also have a child and adolescent related mental health problems. So anxiety disorder is many times comorbid, is what you need to understand. More importantly, anxiety disorders are also comorbid. Please remember, there are 2 points I've made. One is anxiety disorder is comorbid with other mental illnesses. But if you carefully watch, anxiety disorders are comorbid. In a lot of our clients will see OCD, GAD go hand in hand. OCD, GAD, panic disorder go hand in hand. Panic disorder, agoraphobia go hand in hand. Like that, each individual who we see can have multiple anxiety disorders together. Sometimes they can have anxiety disorders and other mental illnesses together. So it's important for us to look at what are we dealing with. So why is this important? Because when we try to explain our patients, it's important for us to realize, okay, this is what we're dealing with. Okay, this guy is having multiple comorbid anxiety conditions, or this guy is having multiple comorbid anxiety and other related mental and emotional conditions. So that will give you clarity in counseling our patients and trying to explain the patients why they need to be taking medications. And we do know anxiety disorders could be quite disabling, and in fact many times requires long-term medications. So if we can psychoeducate our patients, we are able to gain their confidence and make them more compliant with our instructions, which basically makes their quality of life much better. So, as I already emphasized, when you're dealing with anxiety, right, you're dealing with two important issues, fear and worry. When you're talking about fear and worry, you can look at two ways. One is fear can present in psychic or mental aspects of physical aspects. Worry can present as a psychic or a physical presentation. If you look at your patient's presentation in these different ways, it actually would make sense for you to deal with these scenarios in a much more better way. Are you kind of reducing the physical arousal or psychic arousal? Is something you have to ask yourself when you're prescribing medications. So why are you prescribing this molecule? Are you trying to reduce the physical arousal? Are you trying to reduce the psychic arousal? Are you working on the fear component? Are you working on the worry component? That is something we need to look at. Not just this, a lot of times patients don't just come with fear and worry. They come with a lot of, come with consequences. Can you think of some consequences? One of the important consequences we can see is people can present with agoraphobia. People can present with agoraphobia, right? Where they are kind of completely homebound, not going out of the house, kind of staying back at home and not exploring outside enough like other people. So that could be one of the consequences of avoidance. Another common consequence is because of the repeated panic attacks they have, they start doubting their own abilities. They start doubting their own uh, kind of functioning abilities, which can make them kind of lead a very poor quality of life because of panic attacks, which happens mostly in the night. Sometimes they start fearing sleep and they don't want to sleep and they start avoiding sleep. And because the sleep gets disturbed, they start getting into substance use. So even though a patient might come with substance use problem, their primary problem would be anxiety disorder. So as a clinician, we might sometimes be dealing with fear, sometimes we're dealing with worry, sometimes we might be dealing with the consequences of these problems. So identifying the right nature of challenges will help us to help these clients in a much better way. So it's always good to talk to patients in a way that they can understand what is happening, because a lot of times they look up to us to explain them why they might be going through what they're going through. An interesting concept for us to learn here is something called as worry loop. When you tell them that, see, you're thinking too much and it's a loop, right? You're constantly thinking about the same thing again and again. That loop is what we need to treat, and that vicious cycle is what we need to treat, kind of syncs with them and they are able to understand it much better. So this worry loop also has some neuroscience or basic psychopharmacology underpinning. What you need to understand is there is this loop in neuroscience which we have, which is called as the CSTC. CSTC. What does the CSTC stand for? Cortico striato thalamo cortical loop. Cortico striato thalamo cortical loop is the CSTC loop, which is one important component of anxiety problems, which is the CSTC loop. Now, why is it important? Because if you take these four important conditions, GAD, which is nothing but generalized anxiety disorder, PTSD, which is nothing but post-traumatic stress disorder, panic disorder, PD, and phobia. If you take these four important anxiety disorders we are talking about, this loop is the culprit in majority of the scenarios. There's one more important structure. I'll come to it in a few minutes. But what happens with this loop? This worry loop behaves differently in different conditions. For example, people with generalized anxiety disorder, right? They have a persistent worry, but many times the worry is very mild. We would have seen patients who have generalized anxiety disorder. When you ask them, from when are you like this? They would say, Doc, from the time I remember, I've always been a worrier or an anxious person. I always worry. I, by nature, I'm a person who worries. So they might not be able to give you a clear cut onset because they might have mild worry, which has been pretty persistent for a very long time. And recently, maybe it's worsening. That's why they come for help. When you talk about PTSD, it's an extremely different scenario we are talking about. We're talking about some traumatic experience which happens, and that traumatic experience conditions their brain, and post that trauma, they start reliving and re-experiencing the whole thing. That is quite characteristic of PTSD, and the loop here we are talking about gets created with the trauma experience. The loop here gets created with the trauma experience. But please understand, not necessarily that there was no loop before. Maybe there was a vulnerability the person was carrying. The traumatic experience made it very significant. So that is very characteristic of PTSD. And there's a lot of conditioning which would have happened. What do you talk about panic disorder in with respect to the worry loop? When you're talking about the worry loop in panic disorder, you need to understand panic disorder patients will be pretty much okay. Again, they'll have a bout of anxiety. Will be pretty much okay. Again, they'll have a bout of anxiety. Will be pretty much okay. Again, they'll have a bout of anxiety. So it is intermittent. And people with clear-cut panic disorder, the panic attacks are not very mild. They can be pretty severe. Sometimes they end up going to emergency rooms again and again, end up catching up with cardiologists because they are worried about a cardiac status, or they think they might die, and get evaluated multiple times with cardiologists in specific many times, or reaching the emergency room many times. So that's what happens in that loop suddenly gets very activated and then goes off. It gets active and goes off. In phobic patients, it can be quite persistent, and a lot of times phobia is also going to get conditioned based on their own behaviors, right? the phobia gets conditioned and it remains over a period of time. They realize, okay, I'm anxious about this and start avoiding, and that conditions them further with the fear and keep maintaining the loop. So what I'm trying to tell you here is this corticostriatothalamocortical loop. Corticostriatothalamocortical loop is going to be there in all of us. And this loop is going to get activated in different ways in different anxiety disorder conditions. In some, it can be intermittent and very severe. In some, it can get activated because of a traumatic experience. In some, it can be kind of conditioned and you can know expected situations like in phobic patients, or it can be very mild and persistent in generalized anxiety disorder patients. I hope you already remember the point which I made clear. In our patients, we don't see many times only one anxiety disorder. They can have a combination of anxiety disorder. One of the very common combinations we'll see in clinical practice is panic disorder with agoraphobia. Panic disorder with agoraphobia is a common presentation in clinical practice, even though one of the most commonest anxiety disorder we see is generalized anxiety disorder in females, right? So in clinical practice, we might end up seeing a lot of people with panic disorder and agoraphobia. The other important structure when you're talking about anxiety disorder, which you cannot afford not to know, is amygdala. Now, when you're talking about amygdala, it's important for us to realize amygdala is something which gets activated with extreme fear and emotions, right? So this amygdala is specifically known to play a role with panic disorder and phobia. In panic disorder, it is extreme, and in phobia, it has its own role in PTSD too. We'll try to talk about it in just few minutes. Now, I did mention to you about worry loop. I did mention to you about amygdala. You need to understand amygdala has two major connections with the anterior cingulate cortex and the orbitofrontal cortex. Now, ACC, the anterior cingulate cortex and the orbitofrontal cortex, communicate with these two structures. It does communicate with many other structures, but these two structures, three main structures: the amygdala getting communications with the anterior cingulate cortex and the orbitofrontal cortex. This is where you need to understand there are different, each patient presents differently, right? Each patient's primary complaint is going to be very different. Why would all of them who have a corticostriatothalamocortical loop and all of them have amygdala, but why do people present differently? You need to understand people present differently because different structure activation can cause different presentations. For example, we know when periaqueductal gray matter area, when the periaqueductal gray matter area gets activated, it leads to a significant motor response in anxiety disorders. The periaqueductal gray matter area activation leads to significant motor response. When you're talking about motor response, we can see different types of motor response in our patients: flight response, fright response, fight response, freeze. Now, flight, fright, fight, freeze are some things which we always know. We would have read in physiology, we would have read about it in various textbooks, so we have an idea about it. 2 points which I would like to highlight here is, if you're carefully watching your patients and if you're learning from your patients, you would have seen, especially in females, they also too show two other important response: tend response and befriend response. Tend and befriend. Taylor's postulation about how in females especially you can see a tend and a befriend response. What does it mean? If you're carefully watched to in your clinical practice, especially in female gender, you would have seen they start tending and befriending. Like, what does tend basically mean? They kind of start caring more. They start taking up the parental role more. They start taking up the caregiver role more. They start worrying about the people who are dependent on them or the family members and rest of them. And I'm sure you would have seen in many people that one person in the family becomes sick, the mother actually becomes even more sick. I can give you a recent example of one of the patients whom we had seen. This guy had traveled out of the country, and he had been traveling extensively. He had used a lot of weed and other substances because he was just experiencing various things. Ended up having a panic attack when he landed back to India. This had happened about 2 years back. So we had diagnosed him with substance-induced panic attacks, and possibly he also has a panic disorder kind of a symptom presentation. So we had treated him with SSRI. He had taken escitalopram, and he did well for himself. 2 years had passed by. We had tapered, stopped the medication. Everything was okay. Recently, with the new year, he ended up drinking more with his friends and having sleeplessness and partying and those things. All those things maybe could have triggered off his panic attack again. On January 1st, he had his panic attack after about 2 odd years. This patient of mine, this guy realized that this is a panic attack, realized he has to take an SOS medication and talk to his psychiatrist, and he was very much okay with what was happening. The problem was his spouse felt extremely anxious. She felt, why the hell this came back again? We did whole treatment and those. In fact, I felt it was easy to deal with the guy who was having panic attack, but I found it was very difficult to deal with the spouse because her anxiety was climbing significantly. And I'm sure you can relate to these kind of experiences in your practice. Now, please understand, tend and befriend are two common reactions which can happen. Not necessarily only in females, even men can behave like that, even though it is supposed to be reported much more in females. What do you mean by befriend? Befriend has links with oxytocin. Now, befriend is basically ending up making more friends and socialization, wanting to meet people. Now, again, pandemic era, you need to realize they don't socialize much. First of all, it takes a lot of efforts to socialize, and with COVID and those things, the fear of contracting illness is so high that it is also real to some extent. So what you need to realize is these are all potential responses which can trigger off anxieties and sometimes maintain anxiety disorder. So if you can tease these problems, if you can tease the problems and help these clients, that is when you are able to give best responses. Now, like the periaqueductal gray matter area, which plays a role for motor response, you need to understand sometimes fear and anxiety is linked with endocrinal changes. Very commonly, we talk about psychoneuroendocrine, right? Psychoneuroendocrine system. And we know in chronic stress, a lot of people are more prone for viral infections. A lot of people are prone for cancers, especially when they have chronic stress. Now, who's the culprit? Now, you need to understand this amygdala and the worry loop connections, right? They're all interconnected hyperways. And this interconnections involves the hypothalamus. Now, hypothalamus is one, it's a master gland. It's a pinnacle of endocrine system. It kind of decides many things in the endocrine system. Can you imagine when that hypothalamus goes haywire, what can happen? That too chronically over a long period of time. It can obviously lead to a lot of challenges. It can lead to increased cortisol. It can then lead to metabolic syndrome, dyslipidemia, hypertension, diabetes, cerebrovascular accidents, coronary artery diseases, whatnot. And this is where bio you need to understand mind body connections play a role. So what I'm trying to highlight to you is treating anxiety disorders is just not making patients comfortable, because patients come and say, I want to sleep better, help me. I don't want panic attacks, help me. It is just not that. If we don't treat these patients and if they go through anxiety for a long time, we are actually not helping them, because their wear and tear on the body increases and they're more prone for many other physical health issues and mental health issues. So we spoke about periaqueductal gray matter, which plays with the role with the motor system. We spoke about hypothalamus, which plays a role with the endocrinal system. We are talking about another important thing. We are talking about the parabrachial nucleus area. The parabrachial nucleus area plays specifically role in breathing. Have you not seen a lot of your patients coming and complaining one thing? I'm hyperventilating these days. I'm finding breathing difficulty these days. I get suffocated these days. I get choking sensation these days. Who are these people who are having these things? In them, the parabrachial area or the parabrachial nucleus area is quite activated because of the neurotransmitter changes, which leads to this problem. So when the motor system is involved, we are mainly talking about the aqueductal gray matter area. When the endocrinal systems, hypothalamus. When the parabrachial nucleus we are talking about is linked with the breathing issues, which is one of the common presentations which happens, right? Another important area which you should know is blue, locus ceruleus, right? A little bluish in area, that's why it's called as locus ceruleus. Which neurotransmitter are we talking about? We're talking about norepinephrine. Now, norepinephrine release is basically linked with your autonomic system. Basically linked with your autonomic system. Very important for us to know. Now, when I've explained all these points, you might be able to connect almost every patient who presents to you, what might be getting more activated. Is it the locus ceruleus, which is linked with the autonomic system? Is it the breathing issues, which is linked with the parabrachial areas? Is it the uh, hypothalamus, which is linked with what? The endocrine system issues. Or sometimes you have seen patients, right, with who come and present to you with telling, sir, I'm very anxious these days. I and have binge eating. I've been gaining a lot of weight. My friends have been telling about it. I feel bad about myself. Now you need to realize maybe the steroid changes, which is leading to hormonal changes, might be triggering off a lot of changes in his body. And again, if he's already gaining weight, if you're going to give a psychotropic, you need to be careful about choosing the psychotropic, because we know some of these psychotropics can cause weight gain. So you should be a little careful in choice of your molecule in these patients. Like that, what is the other one which I left here? Motor response, we're talking about a periaqueductal gray matter. So I'm summarizing all of these four important specific ways patients can present: the motor response, the autonomic responses, the kind of endocrinal responses, and the breathing systems. So these are the four a couple of points you should also know is when you're talking about the brain, to understand in a brain, keep giving cues internally. Doesn't matter what is happening in the external world, it can give you cues internally from inside. Which is the structure I'm talking about? Hippocampus. Whenever I don't understand something, the first thing I do is go to YouTube and or I go to Google search and type the term, right? Google search, if you type anything which you're not able to understand, it will give you some answer. Now, the internal Google search for us is the hippocampus system. Now, hippocampus stores a lot of things and keeps a lot of our experiences, a lot of past and all those things. Now, hippocampus plays a role there. So this hippocampus, imagine, gets reactivated by itself because of some internal cues. Let's imagine there is no trauma now happening, but these internal cues keep getting activated. Then you know it might be precipitating re-experiencing experience or PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and those. This is how we can explain different small aspects of various neuroscientific aspects which can be happening in these patients, which hippocampus activation is linked with PTSD. Going back to the loop which I was talking to you, which is the cortico-strato-thalamocortical loop, which we were talking about, right? It's important for us to understand. People will come and tell, I'm feeling anxious. Our job doesn't end there to say, okay, there is anxiety. We want to know, what are they anxious about? Are they anxious about future? Are they anxious about past? Are they anxious about their actions? Are they anxious about illness? What are they anxious about? So that will give us an idea of understanding. So when you're talking about this worry loop or the cortico-strato-thalamocortical loop, right, it can produce anxieties which can be linked with misery, or it can be linked with expectations. you are expecting various things, negative outcomes, you're expecting challenges, you're expecting uncertainties. That can be one of the things which gets maintained by this worry loop. Sometimes miseries. We would have done something or we would have not done something and we are stuck with it. Have you not seen a lot of clients whom we see some unfortunate bad experience would have happened and they keep chewing on it and chewing on it and chewing on it and ruminating on it. We do know one interesting finding in our patients who don't respond well would many a times would have rumination as one of the features in them. If you tomorrow onwards look at your patients who are not responding well with your depression medications and all, you will see they'll be not just anxious about future and all, they might be ruminating on the past. I should have not done this, I should have not done like that, maybe I should have done this, maybe I should have done that. So they ruminate. So when you kind of identify they're anxious about what, expectations, misery, and those things will help you to know that the corticostriato-thalamocortical pathway is activated. This worry loop is extremely active in them. And then catastrophization is a common challenge we will go through. They kind of make a big mountain out of a small mole. That's quite common in these people with anxiety disorders. We know that. We speak about it in CBT. The same corticostriato-thalamocortical loop is the culprit, which might also play a role in catastrophization. And of course, obsession. Sometimes people get obsessed. And we know in our practice, like especially since I practice in Bangalore, we end up seeing a lot of young people who are working and possibly getting into relationships. And when they get into relationships, they also end up having breakups and they ruminate on the breakups. They sometimes get obsessed with the breakups. Have you not noticed this quite commonly in your clients? How many of them would come and tell you, Doc, I've left this guy or I've left this girl, but I keep checking on his WhatsApp status. What is he changing? What is he putting? They keep kind of getting obsessed with this person on Facebook and other media. They keep wanting to know what is he doing? What is she doing constantly? They would have left them. They would have had a breakup, but still they're just not able to leave it. That obsession which happens is very different. So if you can identify these things in your clients and tell them, see, possibly these are some circuits, and if you can explain them, a lot of times it makes a lot of sense to them because they always blame themselves for the whole problem. When they realize, okay, these are some things which are happening to them, they actually are willing to work on it. That's important. So getting back to amygdala, which is also another core structure which plays a role in whole of anxiety disorders, right? Now, what complicates here is the bunch of neurotransmitters we have. We don't have one neurotransmitter and we don't have one pathway and one structure. There are a huge number of neurotransmitters playing different role and different points of time. It doesn't end there, right? We all know genetics can play its own role. We know of people where genetics could have played a role. We know anxiety disorders can run in families. Anxiety disorders are more, the family members are more vulnerable to anxiety disorders. First degree relatives are more vulnerable. Why? Why? Let me give an example for us to understand. You can read up further on that in your books. If you're taking about catechol O-methyl transferase, catechol O-methyl transferase breaks down the monoamine transmitters. Now, if you look at catechol O-methyl transferase, there is a met variation, there is a val variation. There is a met variation of catechol O-methyl transferase, and there is a val variation. What happens here is if you have a met variation of COMT, most of the times information processing is normally happening, whereas information processing is little lesser in the val kind of a mutation or polymorphism. Now, what you need to understand is not just the information processing difference. You need to know people with met variation of COMT, they have kind of normal dopamine levels or a little increase in dopamine secretion. Whereas val variation generally have a little lesser dopamine in activity in them. Now, when stress happens, there is an increase in dopamine. Now, you need to realize in people with MET variation, they already are processing information normally, but they already can show spikes of dopamine sometimes. When stress happens, when there is an increase in dopamine, that MET variation people are known to end up into anxiety disorder because there is accumulation of even more dopamine and it leads to trouble. Now here, while even though there is some information processing differences, what is known to happen in them is when the dopamine increases, it doesn't increase to that extent anxiety disorders. Now you might say, so cool, man, it's good to have val mutation then. Now you need to understand, if you have the val type of catechol O-methyl transferase, it might save you from that it might sometimes be leading to psychotic conditions and those. So one condition can get precipitated by one mutation, one more condition can get precipitated one. So that's why when you're reading books, you'll see conflicting results. When you're reading genetics and when you're reading family history, they'll say this can be more, this can be more. The reason is because the brain is not as simple as how I put it across here. It's pretty complex. I'm trying to just emphasize on the most crucial aspects for us to understand. Now, anxiety is basically a hyper state, right? So what is the negative component? We are going to talk about GABA here. Now you need to understand, GABA basically comes from an excitatory substance. GABA is an inhibitory substance. It basically comes from an excitatory substance, that is the glutamate. Now glutamate is broken down to GABA by the glutamic acid decarboxylase. Okay, so an excitatory substance produces the inhibitory substance GABA. This GABA which is produced, right, gets stored in the vesicles. For you to get stored in the vesicles, it should be put into the vesicles. That is where you require this vesicle inhibitory amino acid transporter. Vesicle inhibitory amino acid transporter, which is required for it to put the GABA inside the vesicles and store it for you. So this GABA which is stored can get released, right? When it gets released, termination of GABA can happen in two methods. How does it happen? Two methods. Easy to remember. GABA gets terminated in two methods. Easy to remember with T alphabet. One is GABA transporter, which picks up all the GABA in the synapse and takes it back into the vesicles. Another one is the GABA transaminase, which breaks the GABA. So how does the GABA action get terminated? One is the GABA transporter. Another one is the GABA transaminase. Now, I am not talking something religious here, but I just wanted to kind of highlight something interesting. That's why I've drawn this. Which is the God which comes to your mind when you put up some picture like this? Tirupati, right? Now, typical Hindu who prays would say Govinda, Govinda, Govinda. Now, Govinda, Govinda, Govinda. Three things, right? You should remember when I'm talking about GABA receptor, something important is there. Three important GABA receptors, GABA A, GABA B, and GABA C. In that, you need to understand that GABA A and GABA C are ligand-gated ion channels. Now, which channel is linked with it? The chloride channels are linked with it, and it is ligand-gated ion channels. So that's something which is important. Now, all your benzodiazepines, barbiturates, and Z-class drugs work here. What about GABA B? GABA B is G protein coupled receptors. Now, G protein coupled receptors, and it is linked with which ions? It is linked with the calcium ions and the potassium ions. The drug which plays a role on GABA B is a very important one is baclofen is an example. So GABA A and GABA C are ligand gated ion channel receptors. You need to understand, because they are ligand gated ion channel, they're faster in action. They work pretty fast. That's why, you know, in an emergency room, you give benzodiazepines, small dose, panic attack kind of resolves. When you give mouth dissolving clonazepam, panic attack resolves because they work on the ligand gated ion channel. Imagine if benzodiazepines were working on the G protein coupled. Now, G protein coupled will require a lot of steps to happen, and it's a much longer process. Because it is ion channel is why benzodiazepines work well. So don't forget that point. GABA A and C are ligand-gated ion channel, whereas GABA B is something which is linked with the G protein coupled receptor. Next important point is when you're talking about GABA A, what should you know about GABA A? GABA A has five basic subunits, GABA, five numbers, right? So it has five basic subunits, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now each of the subunit has four transmembrane proteins. Each of the subunit has four transmembrane proteins. Of course, in the center, there is your chloride channel. There is your chloride channel. Based on the subunits, you can say different types of GABA receptors are there. Now, GABA A receptors could be having different subunits. You can have the alpha, beta, gamma, theta, delta, epsilon, pi, and rho. These are all different ones which can be there. There are different isoforms of it further. You can know. Now, what you need to understand, an interesting clinical point is, out of all the isoforms, right, there are few which are supposed to be benzodiazepine insensitive, even though there are many isoforms. Alpha 1 is alpha 1 to 6, beta 1 to 3. Yeah, I think now it's connected, right?
Yes. When you
Yes.
were sir, maybe slightly you will have to go back, sir.
I
When you
didn't
were
hear you, Shira.
when you were explaining about the isoforms, that is when we lost you.
Ah, okay, okay. Isoforms, is it? Okay,
Yes.
fine. No issues. Now, why should you know about isoforms is when there are different isoforms, um, the receptors work very differently. That is where you need to understand there are some things called as benzodiazepine insensitive isoforms. The alpha 4, alpha 6, gamma 1, and delta are isoforms which are not very sensitive to benzodiazepine. So even if you give benzodiazepines, it's not going to work that well with these isoforms. That's an important point. When you're talking about GABA, GABA goes and sits where? GABA goes and sits in between the alpha and the beta unit. In between the alpha and the beta unit, GABA goes and sits. Typically, they say about two molecules of GABA sit on a particular receptor. About two molecules of GABA sit on a particular receptor. That is an important point for us to remember here. Now, why should you remember this?
Sir,
Because
excuse me, sir. We
yeah,
are seeing the presenter view, sir. Maybe you'll have to go to the slideshow mode.
see the slideshow mode.
Yes, sir.
Now also it is the slideshow mode or it has changed?
No, no, it is changed to slideshow and it's not the presenter mode, sir. We are seeing only
Okay,
one slide.
okay, 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 good. So basically, you need to understand that these benzodiazepine insensitive receptors or subunits are very interesting point to make. These are typically extrasynaptic. They are sitting in the extrasynaptic space and plays a role in tonic inhibition. What does it play a role in? Tonic inhibition. I'll come to a point. What does it mean? Now, when I say tonic inhibition, you need to understand it is something which is present over a period of time, right? Tonic inhibition is something which is present. Tone, that's what we mean. So if the drugs which, there are not many drugs which can work on these areas. So if you can develop drugs which are going to work on these specific subunits, maybe you can bring in tonic inhibition. Whereas the current benzodiazepines which we have, which plays a role, is in phasic inhibition, means they are good in reducing the anxiety. So when there is a spike of anxiety, it reduces the anxiety. Otherwise, temperamentally, it might not work that well. So that's an important challenge. Now, when you're talking about phasic anxiety reduction, there are three important alpha units, right? Alpha 1, 2, 3, which can play a role in anxiety reduction. Specifically in that, alpha 1 unit is known to play a role in sleep, whereas alpha 2 and alpha 3 has more role in anxiety. Why is this important for us to know? A clinically relevant point is, you know of these Z class drugs, right? You know of Z class drugs. These Z class drugs typically work on the alpha 1 unit. The Z-class drug typically work on alpha-1 unit, and that is exactly why it is used to induce sleep. Whereas a lot of these benzodiazepines have a lot of action in alpha-2 and alpha-3, but to some extent they also work on alpha-1. That's why they're also a little bit sedative in nature. So phasic benzodiazepine related, whereas the tonic inhibition is related with the non-benzodiazepine related areas. If you put up this kind of a structure, alpha 1, 2, 3, beta 1, 2, 3, gamma 1, 2, 3, what you need to understand is if you take a typical receptor of benzodiazepine receptor, it's going to have 2 units of alpha, 2 units of beta, and 1 unit from GABA 2 or GABA 3. 2 units from alpha 1, 2, 3, 2 units from beta 1, 2, 3, and 1 unit from gamma 2 or gamma 3. That is what typically is going to be there. As I already mentioned to you, GABA goes and sits between the alpha and beta units, whereas benzodiazepines go and sit in the alpha and gamma units. Between alpha and gamma unit, the benzodiazepines go and sit. Between alpha and beta units, your GABA goes and sits. Those are points which are very clinically relevant for us to know. Sleep, I already mentioned to you, plays a role in alpha 1. Anxiolysis is basically alpha 2 and 3. Now you need to understand what they are trying to do at the next level is trying to develop drugs. Which kind of drugs? They're trying to develop drugs which are partial agonists of alpha 2 and 3. Now, when you take benzodiazepines, they seem to be completely working on alpha 2 and 3. They're not partial agonists, they work completely on alpha 2 and 3. Now, why are they trying to develop partial agonists? The reason they're trying to develop partial agonists is because they're trying to see, can we reduce dependency? Can we reduce addiction potential, but still produce anxiolysis? That is exactly why they try to use partial agonists on alpha 2 and alpha 3. These are interesting points for us to know how further research is happening in that area. When you're talking about alpha 2 units, gamma 2 and delta, they are mostly related with epilepsy, and a lot of your drugs which are anti-epileptics are going to work on these subunits specifically, alpha 2, gamma 2, and the delta units in specific. Now, another important point for us to know is when you're dealing with anxiety disorders, right? We do have a class of drugs which we use in anxiety disorders, which is specifically called as voltage sensitive calcium channel antagonists. What type of calcium channel antagonists are they? Voltage sensitive calcium channel antagonists. Specifically, not all kind of calcium channel, they are alpha to delta type. Which are the drugs we are talking about? Alpha to delta type antagonists. The two very important examples, especially with relation to anxiety disorders, are gabapentin and pregabalin. Gabapentin and pregabalin are the two important ones which we should know. When you're dealing with anxiety disorders, you need to understand one of the very important drugs which has a different way of action is the 5-HT1A partial agonist we use. Which is the 5-HT1A partial agonist we use? We have discussed earlier also in one of the lectures. Buspirone is something which we should remember, is a 5-HT1A partial agonist. And there are some antidepressants and antipsychotics which also are having 5-HT partial agonism kind of action, and it is very useful. I'll come to it a little later again. Now, basically, if you look at, we are trying to produce anxiolysis by producing GABA modulation, by producing glutamate modulation, by producing serotonin modulation. By producing all these types of modulation, we are ultimately trying to help these patients of anxiety and trying to see how we can kind of help them. GABA modulation, glutamate modulation, and serotonin modulation. That is what we are trying to produce. Let me highlight something very important for us to know how and why these GABA modulation, serotonin modulation, and other things work. For that, we need to understand when you are trying to choose a drug, which is an anxiolytic, we look at different aspects, right? How do we choose an anxiolytic agent? We have to see what is the diagnosis we like to make, okay, in this patient with the presentation, what kind of diagnosis. Next is, what is the goal? What is the goal as a clinician? What is the goal as a patient or the client? What do they want? What do you want? So that will help us to identify the right choice of drug. Another thing is duration. Two things: how long are they suffering, and how much time are they willing to give you to get treated. The biggest challenge in clinical practice, especially for in private practice and those, is they meet you, right? They say, okay, they might be suffering for last 4 years, but from the time moment they meet you, they want to get better. So you need to understand duration. What is given to you will matter in the choice. Like, for example, if you want to immediately help them, you are forced to think of benzodiazepine as a choice, because no other drug is going to work so fast. And if the patient is extremely sick, yes, you have to give a benzodiazepine to help them immediately. But you need to understand, in a person who is having chronic anxiety, if you can bargain duration with them, you can choose a non-benzodiazepine kind of a drug. You can talk to them. If you can make them understand, boss, you're already going through 3-4 years of anxiety. If you're going to give me a time, we don't need to put you on a habit forming or a potentially addictive substance or an habit forming drug. We can try other drugs. So it is we who need to talk to them and get a bargain on this duration. That will help us to choose the right anxiolytic. And what alternatives are there, and what alternatives are they willing to choose? Like, for example, are they willing to consider psychotherapy? Are they willing to give that time for psychotherapy? Are they willing to spend money on psychotherapy? Those are things which you need to look at. Some of them don't think talk therapies will work. Now, forget about psychiatrists, but clients, there are different kinds. There are clients who believe therapy works and they go to a therapist. There are clients who would believe that therapy, what will talk work? Who can counsel me? I have to change my mind, and they might not want to consider that. So you need to ask yourself, what alternatives do you have in terms of drugs, in terms of treatment modalities? That will help you to choose the right agent. And also, you should also look at each client as potentially getting dependent on a particular substance and ask yourself, is that a potential of dependency? When you look at all these aspects, what is the diagnosis? What is the kind of goal they have? How long have they been suffering, and how much time are they willing to give you realistically for you to help them? Alternatives which are there and dependency possibilities, those will help you to choose the right anxiolytic agent. Of course, we can't talk about all the agents in specific, but in general, you need to understand first line drugs most of the times in anxiety disorders are benzodiazepines, SNRIs, SSRIs. Now I put benzodiazepines in red in color because we all, as psychiatrists or mental health professionals, know, given a choice, it's good not to give benzodiazepines as much as possible. But no doubts, we need to know benzodiazepines have to be given in some patients, and you should choose these patients wisely. They do work beautifully, they are magical, and it has to be given. But you have to be cautious in whom are you giving, why are you giving, when are you giving, how much are you giving. These are questions which you need to ask yourself and then decide about it. When you kind of hesitate to give benzodiazepine, that is when the pharmacotherapy becomes much more interesting when you're dealing with anxiety disorders. Otherwise, you can put everybody on benzodiazepines and most of them will feel better after you start them on benzodiazepines. That's not treatment for anxiety disorders. You need to look at other aspects of it, where SSRIs and SNRIs play a role. Not just that, you have other antidepressants which can be tried. The tricyclics can be tried sometimes. You have the MAO inhibitors which are tried sometimes. Pregabalin, buspirone. Now, pregabalin and buspirone seem to be picking up a lot and have significant role in anxiety disorders, which we know as clinicians who have practiced. There are sometimes other psychotropics which can be tried. Even antipsychotics to some extent are sometimes tried and used. Now, again, please understand these are all third line, fourth line, fifth line drugs where other common drugs which are used are not working. That's when you use. Now, just to highlight a few interesting points here, SSRIs, which is one of the important treatments we use, right? Now, SSRIs in relation to anxiety is a double-edged problem. SSRIs can worsen anxiety, especially initial time. We know when you start an SSRI, a lot of people can have worsening of anxiety problems. But SSRIs, again, are first line kind of drugs in many of the anxiety conditions, right? So SSRI is a double-edged. SSRI itself can cause anxiety. SSRI itself can be the first line drug. That's a challenge which you should remember clinically when you start them on an SSRI. please remember, unfortunate reality with SSRI is the side effects will emerge faster than the effects. SSRI effects will take 2-3 weeks, but the side effect will start from the first dose itself. How many times have you started SSRI today and the next day patient messages you or calls you up and tells, Doc, I'm having vomiting sensation. Is it because of the drug you have given? Please remember, the side effect starts off faster, way much more faster than the effects. So that's the challenge we have. Can you even imagine? Already there is stigma to seek mental health help. And SSRIs are one of the commonly prescribed drugs by psychiatrists. And unfortunately, the drug also doesn't help us as a psychiatrist. It makes it difficult for us by making the journey difficult because the side effects seem to be coming much more faster and making it challenging. Now, treatment takes its own time. We know the down regulation of receptors are important aspect of treatment. That's why it takes significant time. Now, I'll highlight to a very interesting point when you're talking about SSRI. 5-HT1A receptors are predominantly in the limbic system or the subcortical areas. 5-HT1A receptors are predominantly in the limbic system or the subcortical areas where the emotions and anger and impulses and all those control are playing. 5-HT2A receptors are predominantly in higher density in the cortical areas. So please remember, 5-HT2A is more in the cortical areas, 5-HT1A is in the subcortical in the limbic system areas. 5-HT1A specifically is important for anxiety disorders because we seem to see one pattern. Drugs which are kind of working on 5-HT1A seem to have some ability to work in anxiety disorders. That's where partial agonists seem to have its own role, like buspirone, which I mentioned. Now, buspirone does not work on GABA, whereas it is still an anxiolytic kind of a drug. Because it does not work on GABA, it does not have sedation, it does not have dependence potential, it does not work on seizure treatments. But you also need to understand the drawback with buspirone is it does not have immediate effect. Your benzodiazepines have immediate effect. You can give in emergency rooms. You can't give buspirone in an emergency room and tell a patient, now your panic will settle down. No, it takes 2-3 weeks to work. So people with chronic anxiety, people with anxiety which has been long-standing, and people where you're trying to treat anxiety on the long-term basis, that's where you should consider buspirone, not as an anxiolytic for immediate situation. It doesn't work in those kind of situations, is what you need to remember here. Now, that is where, again, you need to remember these two drugs, vilazodone and vortioxetine. These two drugs seem to be promising to you, even though currently FDA has licensed these drugs for specifically major depressive disorder. It seems to be having complex actions. 5-HT1A partial agonism is one of the actions which seems to be happening, especially with vilazodone. And maybe you can try in some of the anxiety disorder patients, especially they're resistant to the routine SSRIs, you can give a try. I've seen it to be useful in some of the patients with anxiety disorders, especially with people who are cognitively worrying too much. And those, I've seen them kind of responding pretty well with vilazodone in these populations. So you can think about it. Now, when you're talking about 5-HT2A areas, they play a role in prefrontal cortex, cingulate cortex, and the posterior cingulate cortex. Now, I'm highlighting this point for next. I'm priming you for something which I'm going to discuss the next few minutes after this. Now, 5-HT2A receptors are predominantly sitting in the cortical areas. Now, prefrontal cortex, the cingulate cortex, and the posterior cingulate. Now, cingulate cortex, in simple terms, we can remember is almost like our, kind of a braking system. It says, no, this is too much. No, this is too less. So it's kind of a braking system, the cingulate cortex, which plays a role in. So anterior cingulate, posterior cingulate, they all seem to play a role. So if you're reading OCD, again, you will read about anterior cingulate cortex, because in OCD, braking system is not working well. So they get into repetitive behaviors, repetitive thoughts and actions. So whenever you read about cingulate cortex, you need to remember about it. Now, prefrontal cortex is extremely important because all of our psychiatry is related to prefrontal cortex in some way or the other, right? Psychiatry is linked with prefrontal cortex in some way or the other. All your therapies, different schools of therapy ultimately work on the prefrontal cortex at some point of time or the other. Of course, sometimes inside facilitation can happen right from the limbic area to the cortex, but you need to understand cortex involvement, especially prefrontal cortex involvement, it becomes important in any kind of therapy. So what am I trying to prime you here is an important point. If you said I'm a guideline based doctor. If you're especially sitting in US, they have to many times consider FDA approved treatments. I'll show you a small chart which makes it difficult in terms of psychiatric practice, right? So let's take the 4 important psychiatric conditions. If you see the FDA approved treatments for these conditions, there are some patterns which we can learn. There are some interesting points which we can learn. What are the patterns and what are the points we can learn here? Let me highlight to you. For example, if you take PTSD, there are only 2 FDA approved drugs which are there, sertraline, paroxetine. GAD seems to have a few more, panic disorder have a few more, social anxiety disorder have a few more. But PTSD just has 2 FDA approved drugs, sertraline and paroxetine. You don't seem to have any other FDA approved ones for that. Now, if you see paroxetine, which is a drug, if you have a clinician which have been using paroxetine, you might see a lot of your its antidepressant effect still is questionable. And again, paroxetine is one of the drugs which we all know can also increase the suicidal thoughts in some of these patients who are vulnerable, right? So paroxetine seems to have some role in anxiety disorders. So if a patient is more of an anxiety patient rather than a depression patient, maybe looks like a better choice of paroxetine, because paroxetine, if you see, seems to be licensed for social anxiety, panic disorder, GAD, and PTSD as per FDA. Okay, not that you have to believe whatever FDA approves, but you need to understand they're one of these stringent systems which are available in the world for you to pick up. So it gives you an idea of what works and what doesn't work. So sertraline is the next best SSRI, if you see, is working in most of these conditions. So sertraline. Now let me highlight you an interesting point here. One thing, when we do CMEs and conferences where we involve physicians and talk to them, right? We keep telling them, please don't prescribe alprazolam, please don't prescribe alprazolam, please don't prescribe alprazolam. Why? Because we know out of all the benzodiazepines which are commonly prescribed, especially alprazolam is so rampantly prescribed, and it is such a habit-forming drug that a lot of them find it difficult to quit it. See, they might not abuse and they might not get into full-blown addiction, but the dependency on even therapeutic dose of alprazolam is very, very, very high. So if at all possible, never start a patient on alprazolam, even though it is one of the FDA approved strategies for GAD and panic disorder. As much as possible, try to avoid it. We are more prone to kind of prescribe clonazepam, which is again known. We know clonazepam, because of its longer acting, has lesser chances of producing addictive abilities, but we know a lot of patients become reliant on it and need it even at therapeutic doses for very, very long times, which can happen. Now, it has its own challenges with prescription in terms of medications and those, but it is important for you to know that with this chart, you will realize we have very less options of really known FDA approved strategies for anxiety disorder. So you're going to follow just FDA kind of strategies, very less choices for you. But in routine clinical practice, you need to understand each of the drugs which are there have its own plus and minuses. You need to look at various plus and minus and then take a call. An interesting point I would like to make here is fluoxamine is one drug which is licensed for OCD and social anxiety disorder. It is actually not licensed for major depressive disorder. I did speak to you about that in one of the earlier series sessions, right? So fluoxamine is kind of licensed for social anxiety and OCD, but not necessarily for depression as per FDA. Now, I like to kind of go with the next part of it by trying to highlight something very, very important and very challenging for us. In routine clinical practice, what's our biggest barrier? What's our biggest barrier? The biggest barrier is time. The time patients give us. The time patients give us for effect, time patients give us for side effect, time patients give for dosing the medication. What is the biggest challenge? If you read any guideline, they'll say give 6 weeks of this trial, 3 months of that trial for OCD. Which patient is going to give you 3 months of time to say, doc, I will wait for it? Very difficult, right? Very difficult. So the biggest barrier is not or not. We know a lot of things. We would like to help our patients. Time is something which is very difficult to get from our patients, is what you need to understand. They don't give you time for effect. But unfortunately, a lot of side effects happen from the first dose itself or the second dose itself. The first few doses itself, you start seeing side effects. So here is the challenge you have. So the biggest barrier you have is time for you to realize. So when you're doing clinical practice, that complicates the whole problem. Another important barrier I want to tell you here is we always will have this challenge when you're giving medications. Patients will respond. See, when patients respond completely, you're happy. Patient is happy, you are happy, problem sorted out. Is it sorted out? I'll come to it also. But you need to understand one of the important challenging barriers is whether partially responded patient, should you augment or should you switch? Should you add something or should you change the patient to a newer molecule? That's a constant question you will have. A very simple template you can always use is ask yourself, first of all, you have started some medication. Is there an effect? If there is no effect, you have to switch the molecule. If there is no effect, you have to switch the molecule, especially if you have given adequate dosage and if you're given adequate time, the patient is not responding. There's no point until unless you want to think of giving some supra threshold and see, you want to kind of, if there's no effect, there's no point in kind of waiting, you have to switch. But if there is an effect, don't augment immediately. Ask yourself some question. Could this effect be because of the drug or is it because of placebo response? Could it be some psychotherapy which the patient is going on, which is actually helping the patient and not necessarily the drug you're giving? Is the patient compliant? Patients sometimes are 60% compliant and they are partially responding. The best thing to do is to make them 100% compliant or as much as compliant as possible. So rather than adding a new molecule, increase their compliance and adherence, you might get better response. Also ask yourself, okay, is this person responding partially, but is he having side effects or is she having side effects? If they are having a lot of side effects, will they be able to tolerate a higher dosage, or will they be needing shifting to another molecule, or will they be needing an addition of a molecule? That's how you need to ask yourself questions. So when you look at these templates, then you'll be able to decide whether you want to augment or switch. So next time when you are in this clinical dilemma, whether you want to augment or switch, first question you should ask yourself is there an effect? If there is an effect, is it because of the drug? Is it a placebo response? Is it because of the therapy the person is going through? Is it because some adherence plus or minus is happening? What is the level of side effects? Will the person be able to tolerate further side effects or not when I add a molecule? That's what will help you to decide clinically, because clinically, never life is going to be easy. Let me lead you to another important challenge clinically will have. I don't think a lot of lectures happen where they talk to you about this. No pharmaceutical company will ever conduct a CME on how to wean off drugs, because it is going to be against their own businesses, right? So you need to understand the biggest challenge for a clinician is not to start the medication. As psychiatrist, I always tell my patients, psychiatrist's job is pretty tough. Why? First of all, when they come to us, we have to convince them why they need medication. Second, when they're taking medication, they might have plus and minus side effects. They might be wanting to stop medicine. So you want to convince them to maintain them on medication. Third challenge as a psychiatrist is, see, when you want to put them on medicine, you have to counsel them. When you want to maintain them on medicine, you have to counsel them. When you want to stop medicine, still you have to do counseling, because they start asking you questions. Doc, if you stop the medicine, will it not come back? If you stop the medicine, if I worsen, what do I do? So you need to understand a psychiatrist's job is pretty challenging, because you counsel them to start the medicine, you counsel them to maintain the medicine, you also have to counsel them to wean off the medication. Now, my question is, think about it. Ask yourself, we do start so many people in a year on medication. How many of them do we actually slowly taper and stop in a year? I'm sure we all know it's a handful of people, right? Because we don't talk about it in many of our patients. And when patients are fine, taking it for a long time, when patients have settled down and not much of side effects happening, we know our medications are pretty safe, generally speaking, many a times. So most of the times, patient is calm, we are calm, we keep saying repeat and move on. But we need to also understand we should talk about art of weaning. We need to actually have CMEs where we talk about art of weaning medication, the challenges which can happen. I'll just go through few highlights here. It should be a deliberate effort to stop at some point of time, especially when patients are really doing fine for a steady long time. You have to think of it. At least 9 months, 12 months, 1 year minimum, we give in anxiety, at least to settle down. If they're really doing well, more than a year or so, you can think of should we be stopping medication in these people? A deliberate effort should be made by us as clinicians. Patients can come and ask us, but are we also thinking about it is the question. I want you to think about it, because a lot of times we don't want to think. Second is, we should also ask ourselves, what could be the pros and cons? If the person stops the medicine, what could be the downfall? If the person continues the medicine, what could be the plus and minus? So we should weigh all these things, and we should start talking about it to our patients. So that's a very important aspect of art of weaning, which is important. We also need to look at self-efficacy. One of the important things you need to realize is it's very easy to become God here, right? Patients many times will come and say, Doc, the moment you prescribe the medication, I don't know what you prescribed, but it's really working miraculously. I'm pretty much fine. Now, it makes me feel great that my psychopharmacology is working. It makes me feel great that my prescription is working. But you need to understand, we need to build self-efficacy in the individual. The fact that they even take the medicine regularly is a choice they make every single time. The fact that they go through therapy sessions is a choice they make. They go through yoga sessions, meditation, therapy, whatever they do regularly is something they do. We need to build their self-efficacy, because that is a component of weaning. Because when we wean off medication, if you have not built enough self-efficacy, the dependency on the therapist, the dependency on the psychiatrist, the dependency on the medication is going to be pretty high, and you are going to see challenges in these kind of patients. So if you want to wean, you need to work on these things. It should be a deliberate effort. You should work on pros and cons. You should work on self-efficacy in those. And it's always important for you to highlight on various aspects on withdrawal, relapse, recurrence, and newer illness, whether there is a new illness onset or whether the old symptoms have come back, whether it is a recurrence or a relapse. Or you also have to always talk to them that they can have withdrawal symptoms. When you don't educate them about withdrawal symptoms, tapering and stopping any medication is next to impossible task, for a simple reason, because most of them will have withdrawal symptoms and they find it very difficult to deal with. So another, if you look at these aspects, I'm sure you will understand art of weaning is a challenge. I can talk to you about art of weaning various medications separately. It's a huge topic, but I'm trying to highlight here just the important aspects which could be important. Now, I'm trying to keep it too crisp and to the point, very clinical and very day to day. If you're looking at many drugs which are commonly used in pregnancy, we know anxieties and those things can increase post pregnancy. We know depression, anxiety, those are challenges. Two drugs which you should preferably avoid as much as possible is paroxetine and benzodiazepine. When you're prescribing, ask yourself, is the person in childbearing age and is there a potential of becoming pregnant? And please remember an important statistic: half of the pregnancies are going to be unplanned pregnancies. Even though you might be telling people, see, I'm prescribing you medication, be careful. If you're thinking of pregnancy, you need to understand a lot of times 50% of the pregnancies could be unplanned. So when they already realize that they are pregnant, they're already in first, second trimester in. So please understand, it's always important to be careful about it. What medications are you prescribing? Sensitize people about what are the potential challenges which can be happening. Try to avoid paroxetine. and benzodiazepines, which are two important drugs used in anxiety disorders in these patients, as much as you can. Now, you need to understand, you need to look beyond benzodiazepines and SSRIs and the drugs which I spoke to you about. What are the various other combinations of drugs which you need to look about? Like traditionally, in my initial practice, right, I used to typically start patients on benzodiazepines because it will give immediate relief. Patients are happy. I am happy that I'm seeing results. And I'm also starting SSRIs because I know they're pretty safe in those. This is what typically would happen. Nowadays, my practice has changed a lot because I've seen the challenges of giving benzodiazepines over a period of time. Whenever I'm giving benzodiazepines over a period of time, they're ending into bigger problems over a period of time. There are a lot of other challenges which are coming up. So we don't want to give benzodiazepines for a very long time. In all those people, you want to think about benzodiazepines, beyond benzodiazepines. What can you think of? Think of drugs like buspirone. Think of pregabalin. Think of drug like trazodone. Think a drug like mirtazapine. Think of drug like hydroxyzine. Now, these are all prazosin. These are all drugs which have its own roles in specific anxiety conditions. But you need to think of these when you're prescribing. These are not routinely prescribed by us to treat anxiety conditions, but you need to think of. Why I'm stressing this point is because if you think of these as choices in your patients, for example, if somebody is complaining of sleep issues with a lot of anxiety, immediately my hand is going to go towards prescribing some kind of a benzodiazepine. But instead of that, could you think of a small dose of trazodone or mirtazapine, which has antidepressant effect, which has sedative effect, especially even small doses of them are known to beautifully help sedation as a problem. So you can think of it. Sometimes even pregabalin has a little bit of sedative effect, which could be useful. Buspirone is not sedative, but is an anxiolytic, which can be helpful. Can you think of prazosin's role? Prazosin is specifically useful in people to reduce nightmares which are especially related to PTSD. Prazosin is specifically useful. It works on the alpha 1 blockade and produces kind of significant improvement in people with nightmares, specifically in PTSD patients. So you don't need to always prescribe benzodiazepines for sleep and anxiolysis. You can think of these drugs as some alternatives so that we reduce the burden of putting patients on benzodiazepines and then worrying about what will happen to these people over a period of time. So that's something you need to know. Now, I would like to highlight something very important and then kind of summarize further. I did show you this slide earlier where I told you about 5HT2A and I also told you about the different kind of cortical areas which play a role, right? The cortical areas which play a role. Why did I specifically mention that? Is because of this reason. The point I want you to highlight to you is if you look at fear conditioning which happens, what we know today in science is this. We know very simple. Fear conditioning is something which happens, which is a fear response. Now, the fear response is going to be so strong in people that it is very difficult to remove a fear response. And in fact, a lot of times anxiety disorders, which are kind of full-fledged, right? They don't completely go away. They can be remain in hidden. They can come back at some point of time. Some significant issues happen. So please remember the fear response, which is in this slide. If you see, right, this side, right, you can see on the right side, that is the fear response which is happening. Now, what do you need to know of important here is all your therapy, all your kind of reconditioning and other things which you're working upon is working on this. In the amygdala, there is this area called as intercalated area. In the intercalated area, there are a lot of these GABA neurons. What do these GABA neurons do? They go and inhibit some of these extremely stimulated neurons. The GABA neurons in the intercalated mass of the amygdala go and stimulate. Now, if you see, you can see a dotted line which comes from the hippocampus and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Now, when you're talking about prefrontal cortex, this is where your therapy comes in. Have you seen one interesting point in a lot of your patients whom you see with anxiety disorders? When you explain to them why they suffer what they suffer, they actually get to learn to deal with their anxieties much better. If they realize that panic attack is very severe, it does make them feel very bad, but they're not going to die because of that. They learn to live with it. So it's important for you to understand when you're giving this psycho education. I don't know in which condition it can help even more, but it is one situation where anxiety disorder patients, educating them about what could be happening could be extremely important. So if you want to break this fear conditioning, there are two ways of breaking the fear conditioning. One is fear extinction, and another is reconsolidation processes which is to be done. Now, due to lack of time, I might not be able to go into each of these conditions and talk to you about it, because it's a very important areas for you to know. I think Dr. Mahesh from Telearogya team was telling he's planning some psychotherapy sessions. I'm hoping that they might be talking about trauma and pain. At that time, they might be highlighting to you. But as a clinician, as a psychiatrist, I would like to highlight to you something interesting here. Why is this important? Because now, when you're looking at we always like new love, right? We like to change. We like to upgrade ourselves. Now our love for benzodiazepines is gone. We know benzodiazepines are very useful, but has its own problems. SSRI has reached its limit. So we are trying to find out newer ways of anxieties and dealing with anxieties. So when you're talking about thinking beyond benzodiazepines, you can also think of various other newer targets. There are targets which are coming up for glutamate, GABA modulation, neurosteroids is some new area where a lot of work is happening. BDNF modulation. Now, BDNF is known to play a role in depression. The neurosteroids are known to play a role in hippocampus modulation. Glutamate is definitely known to play in a lot of selected areas. Why glutamate modulation is because they're trying to see whether glutamate is linked with new learning ability. So can we give some medication which can increase glutamate, specifically when you're also learning new things? What learning you're talking about? You're talking about remodeling techniques and other strategies like EMDR strategies, remodeling strategies, right? When you're doing this remodeling strategies and all, we are kind of basically trying to see, can we change the patient's experiences? Can we change the patient's experiences by remodeling their experience with various therapy sessions, desensitization therapy sessions, EMDR sessions? We would have seen some patients responding very well with a lot of extreme anxiety post trauma or breakup or anything like that, right? When we give beta blockers, especially they're significantly physiologically aroused, when you give small doses of beta blockers and in combination of clonazepam, you would have seen that their arousal comes down. When their arousal comes down, their reconsolidation and rewiring can happen. So we know today that brain is extremely malleable. Brain can be malleable through therapy. Brain can be malleable through actions. Brain can be malleable through medications. Now, as psychiatrists, we have a bunch of medications. It's our job to identify which patient requires which kind of medication. That's where learning about some basic neuroscience, which kind of receptors could be getting triggered here, which kind of molecule would be very helpful, would help you. So I think I have kind of highlighted to you various aspects of these medications, which kind of medications could be useful. And I've given you various principles on which you can think about. I thank you for listening to this whole session. I'm sorry for some glitches which happened technically, which made you lose some time. I hope I will do a dry run for the next session so that you will not have any problems in the next session. I'll try my best for that. Thank you very much. Looking forward for the next session, which is all important session where we'll be talking about sleep and those. So that's something which is extremely important. We're going to take up. Thank you very much. Have a great night and looking forward to catch up with you all in the next session. Thank you.